The easiest person to lose is the one who never asks you to stay. Those were the words that haunted me long before I understood they were about us. When Claire Bennett placed a single ivory envelope on the corner of my desk, I didn't look up immediately. My attention stayed fixed on the quarterly earnings report glowing across my monitor, another record-breaking quarter for Hayes Global Holdings, another headline the financial networks would celebrate before the opening bell. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Manhattan office, the skyline shimmered beneath a pale winter sunrise, every tower reflecting the success I had spent 30 years building one impossible decision at a time. People often called me the Ice Queen of Wall Street. They said I never smiled, never hesitated, never forgave mistakes. I never corrected them because every rumor made negotiations easier. Fear closed deals faster than kindness ever could. "Your 9 o'clock is waiting," Claire said softly. Her voice carried the calm certainty that somehow cut through the endless noise of my schedule. "Move them to 10, I answered without lifting my eyes. "Already done." I signed another document. "The Zurich call?" "Rescheduled for this afternoon." "The investor dinner?" "Chef confirmed the updated menu yesterday." There was always another question, and somehow Claire always had the answer before I finished asking it. For 6 years, she had quietly become the rhythm behind every successful day of my life. I rarely noticed because everything simply worked. Flights were never delayed. Meetings never overlapped. My coffee was always exactly the right temperature. Medication appeared beside my water glass before I remembered I had a headache. My favorite navy coat somehow found its way into the car before every unexpected snowfall. I had convinced myself those things happened because excellence was expected inside my company. Excellence, however, had a name. Claire stood across from my desk with perfect posture, her dark brown hair tucked neatly behind one ear, wearing the same understated elegance she always favored. Most people grew nervous around me. Claire never looked frightened. Respectful, yes. Professional, always. But never afraid. Looking back now, I think that was the first reason I trusted her more than anyone else. Finally, I reached for the envelope. No logo. No priority stamp. Just my name written in Claire's unmistakably careful handwriting. "What's this?" I asked. She met my eyes, and for the first time since I had hired her, I noticed something missing. She wasn't waiting for another instruction. She wasn't anticipating my next request. She was simply still. "My resignation," she said. 4 syllables. Barely louder than a whisper. Somehow they echoed louder than every market bell I had ever heard. I stared at her without speaking. The silence stretched across the office until it felt almost tangible. Then, because pride had always spoken faster than my heart, I slid the envelope back onto the polished walnut desk and said the words that would follow me every single day afterward. "Close the door on your way out." The sound of the closing door should have meant nothing to me. Doors opened and closed every minute inside Hayes Global Holdings. Executives came and went. Partners retired. Competitors disappeared. I had built my career believing no individual was ever bigger than the company. So I picked up my pen, signed the merger documents waiting beside my laptop, and pressed the intercom. "Send Daniel in." There was a pause before the receptionist answered. "He is already here, Ms. Hayes." Exactly 30 seconds later, Daniel entered carrying 3 folders against his chest. He looked unusually nervous. "Your coffee, Ms. Hayes?" he asked. I glanced toward the empty corner of my desk. No porcelain cup. No faint aroma of freshly roasted Colombian beans. Claire always placed it there 5 minutes before my first meeting. Daniel noticed my expression and quickly apologized. "I am sorry. I thought someone had already." He stopped himself. Of course he had. Everyone inside this building unconsciously assumed Claire had already handled it. "Forget it," I said. "Start the presentation." He connected his laptop to the conference screen, but the financial projections appeared in the wrong order. A vice president corrected him. Someone requested the outdated revenue forecast. Another executive interrupted to ask where the revised European compliance report had gone. Normally those questions never reached me. Claire quietly anticipated every possible problem before anyone noticed it existed. I folded my hands together, forcing myself to ignore the growing disorder around the table. By noon, my calendar had already slipped behind schedule by 45 minutes. The Zurich investors were waiting. The legal department had not received the latest contracts. My lunch meeting arrived at the wrong restaurant because someone forgot to update the reservation after I changed locations the previous evening. Tiny inconveniences. That was all they were. Yet they accumulated like snowflakes during a blizzard, each one too small to matter until suddenly the entire city stopped moving. Late that afternoon, I walked into my private office expecting the familiar silence that usually helped me think. Instead, I found unopened mail scattered across the seating area, 2 unsigned documents resting on the coffee table, and 3 sticky notes attached to my monitor from different departments asking questions Claire would have answered without ever involving me. I reached for my desk drawer, searching for the headache medicine I always kept there. It was empty. For several seconds I simply stared inside the drawer. Then I remembered. Claire had been the one replacing the bottle every month before it ran out. I had never once asked her to do it. She had simply noticed. My phone buzzed with a message from the board chairman congratulating me on another successful quarter. I should have felt proud. Instead, the office felt strangely unfamiliar, as though someone had quietly rearranged the walls while I was not looking. As evening settled over Manhattan, the city lights reflected across the glass surrounding my office. For years I believed loneliness was the price of extraordinary success. I had accepted it long ago. Yet sitting there surrounded by everything I had fought to build, I realized something unsettling. The room had not become quieter because Claire left. It had become emptier because I had never understood how much of its warmth had always belonged to her. I told myself the feeling would pass after a few days. Every transition inside a company created temporary confusion. That was what I had always believed, and beliefs were easier to manage than emotions. By Friday morning, however, my office had become a place where small imperfections quietly announced her absence. The orchids by the windows had begun to droop because no one remembered they needed just enough water to stay healthy but never enough to drown the roots. The leather notebook I carried to every board meeting was still sitting in yesterday's briefcase because no one had placed it on my desk before sunrise. Even the lighting felt different. Claire always lowered the blinds by exactly 2 inches after noon because she knew the afternoon glare reflected against my computer screen. I had never noticed her doing it. I only noticed when the sunlight forced me to squint through an earnings report. During lunch, Daniel entered holding a stack of scheduling requests. 3 departments want your approval before 5 o'clock, he said carefully. There are also 2 interviews for the executive assistant position next week. I nodded without looking up. Fine. He hesitated. Human Resources asked whether you would like to review the candidates personally. No. Hire whoever meets the qualifications. The words sounded efficient, but even as I said them, I realized I was asking for something impossible. Qualifications could be measured. Loyalty could not. Experience could be listed on a resume. Quiet understanding never appeared beneath someone's name. That afternoon, I walked through the executive floor for the first time in months instead of remaining inside my office. Employees greeted me politely before returning to their work with the familiar mixture of respect and caution. Near the break room, I overheard 2 analysts speaking in lowered voices. I still cannot believe Claire resigned, one of them said. She remembered everyone's birthday. The other smiled sadly. She even brought soup when my daughter was sick. She somehow knew I had not slept all night. They fell silent the moment they noticed me passing. Neither of them mentioned deadlines or presentations or million-dollar negotiations. They remembered kindness. I continued walking, but their conversation stayed with me. How many moments had happened around me without my ever seeing them? Back inside my office, I opened a cabinet searching for an old acquisition file. Instead, I found a row of neatly labeled storage boxes arranged with impossible precision. Every document had colored tabs. Every archive had handwritten notes explaining where related files could be found. The handwriting belonged to Claire. She had organized years of company history so carefully that anyone could understand it without asking for help. Tucked inside the final box was a small envelope addressed only to facilities. It contained instructions for maintaining my office whenever I traveled, including the exact temperature I preferred, the brand of tea I drank during winter, and a reminder to replace the framed photograph of my parents if it was ever damaged. My fingers lingered over the page longer than they should have. She had memorized details I had forgotten about myself. I leaned back in my chair as evening settled over Manhattan once again. The city below buzzed with endless ambition, every light representing another person chasing success. I had spent decades believing achievements were built through discipline alone. Yet the more I looked around the office, the more I understood an uncomfortable truth. The strongest foundation beneath everything I had built had never been fear, authority, or wealth. It had been the quiet devotion of one woman I had mistaken for part of the furniture until the day she was no longer there. The following Monday, I arrived before sunrise, hoping work would drown out thoughts that had become impossible to silence. Manhattan still slept beneath a blanket of pale blue light as I stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor. For years, I had treasured those quiet minutes before the building filled with conversations and ringing phones. Now the silence felt different. It no longer belonged to me. It reminded me of someone who was missing. I unlocked my office and instinctively waited for the familiar scent of fresh coffee to greet me. Nothing. The room stood exactly as I had left it the previous Friday, immaculate but strangely lifeless. My eyes drifted toward the empty desk outside my office. Claire had occupied that space for 6 years. From there she had welcomed anxious investors, reassured nervous employees, and somehow protected my schedule from collapsing under the weight of impossible expectations. I remembered the countless mornings I had walked past her without more than a brief nod. I had assumed she would always be there. Around 8 o'clock, Human Resources delivered the resumes of several promising candidates. Outstanding universities. Impressive executive experience. Exceptional recommendations. I flipped through every page without absorbing a single word. One applicant spoke 4 languages. Another had coordinated international mergers worth billions of dollars. A third had worked for a United States senator. On paper they were extraordinary. Yet none of them knew that I disliked meetings beginning exactly on the hour because I preferred 60 seconds to collect my thoughts. None of them would remember that I always became unusually quiet on the anniversary of my father's passing. None of them would silently replace a fading fountain pen before an important contract signing because they had noticed the ink running low the previous afternoon. Those things could never be listed on a resume. During an afternoon strategy session, one of the board members asked a routine question. "Victoria, have we heard anything from Claire since her departure?" I answered more quickly than I intended. No. The room fell silent for a brief moment before the discussion returned to revenue projections and expansion plans. Even so, I caught several curious glances. Apparently everyone else had noticed the change in me before I had admitted it to myself. That evening, instead of heading directly home, I remained alone in the office. The city lights reflected across the glass until the skyline resembled thousands of distant stars. My attention wandered toward a bookshelf beside the conference table. Between 2 annual reports rested a small hardcover notebook I had never opened before. Inside were pages of handwritten reminders in Claire's careful script. Some were business-related, but others were surprisingly personal. Remember to congratulate Ms. Rodriguez after her son's graduation. Order lilies for the lobby every March because Ms. Hayes once said they reminded her of home. Keep peppermint tea in the cabinet during winter. She never asks for it, but she always drinks it. I slowly closed the notebook, feeling an unfamiliar weight settle in my chest. She had spent years paying attention to details I never realized I had revealed. Meanwhile, I struggled to remember the last time I had asked how her weekend had been or whether she had made it home safely during a snowstorm. For the first time in decades, I questioned something far more valuable than a business decision. I questioned the kind of person I had become. Success had taught me how to build an empire, but somewhere along the way I had forgotten how to truly see the people standing quietly beside me. And the woman I had overlooked more than anyone else was already gone. 3 days later, I did something my board would have considered irrational. I canceled an acquisition meeting that had been on my calendar for nearly 6 months. No emergency had forced the decision. No investor had withdrawn. I simply could not concentrate. Every spreadsheet blurred together because my mind kept returning to the same impossible question. Where was Claire now? I hated the question the moment it appeared because it sounded dangerously personal. For years, I had trained myself to separate business from emotion. That discipline had made me successful. It had also made me blind. I pressed the intercom. "Daniel, could you come in for a moment?" He entered carrying his tablet. "Yes, Miss Hayes?" I hesitated for several seconds, an eternity for someone who usually made decisions in an instant. "Has anyone heard from Claire?" His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Only a few people. She sent thank you notes to human resources and facilities after she left. Everyone said she seemed happy." Happy. The word landed harder than I expected. She deserved to be happy. So why did the thought leave such an uncomfortable ache inside me? "Do you know where she is working now?" I asked, trying to sound detached. Daniel shook his head. "No, ma'am. She told everyone she wanted a fresh start." After he left, I found myself staring out the window again. Thousands of people moved through the streets below with purpose, each carrying dreams invisible to everyone around them. Claire had probably walked those same sidewalks every morning for years, coffee in one hand, tablet in the other, already thinking 3 steps ahead so my day would unfold without interruption. I had never once wondered what her own dreams looked like. That realization stayed with me all afternoon. Around 6 o'clock, I decided to leave the office earlier than usual. Instead of asking my driver to take me home, I quietly told him to head toward the Upper West Side. There was a small neighborhood cafe I vaguely remembered Claire mentioning years ago after recommending their cinnamon tea to one of our clients. I had barely listened at the time. Somehow the memory had survived anyway. The cafe was warm, filled with soft conversations and the comforting aroma of fresh bread. No one recognized me beneath my wool coat and simple scarf. For the first time in years, I sat alone without an assistant managing the next minute of my life. I ordered the same cinnamon tea Claire had once described with unexpected enthusiasm. When the waitress placed the steaming cup in front of me, I smiled politely out of habit. 1 sip later, I understood why Claire loved it. It tasted gentle, familiar, almost comforting in a way expensive wines and exclusive restaurants never had. I looked around the room, imagining Claire laughing with friends here after work, perhaps reading a novel near the window while snow drifted outside. It occurred to me that there was an entire version of her life I had never cared enough to discover. I knew her calendar better than I knew her favorite color. I knew which investors she could persuade in 5 minutes, but not what made her genuinely laugh. As I wrapped both hands around the warm mug, another unsettling thought settled quietly into my heart. I did not miss having an exceptional assistant. I missed the woman whose quiet presence had become the safest part of my everyday, and I had not realized it until she had already walked away. The following morning, I arrived at the office carrying a decision I could no longer postpone. Instead of heading directly into my office, I walked to Human Resources for the first time in years. The director looked genuinely surprised to see me standing outside her door without an appointment. "Good morning, Ms. Hayes. Is everything all right?" she asked. "I need Claire Bennett's forwarding information," I replied. Her expression shifted from surprise to hesitation. "I am sorry, but we cannot release personal information without permission." Of course they could not. Those were the policies I had personally approved years earlier. For a brief second, I almost smiled at the irony. The rules I believed protected people were now keeping me from the one person I wanted to find. I thanked her and returned to my office without another word. By lunchtime, I had accomplished almost nothing. Numbers that once made perfect sense now blurred together on every screen. During a meeting with international partners, I caught myself searching the empty chair beside the conference table before remembering it would remain empty. Nobody quietly placed updated reports beside my notebook. Nobody anticipated the questions I had not yet asked. The meeting ended successfully according to everyone else, but I walked away feeling strangely defeated. Late that afternoon, Daniel knocked softly before entering. "There is someone here from facilities," he said. "They found a box with Claire's name in the storage room. They assumed she left it behind." I asked him to bring it in. The cardboard box was smaller than I expected. Inside were ordinary things that somehow felt deeply personal. A ceramic coffee mug with tiny blue flowers painted around the rim. A light gray sweater folded neatly. A collection of colorful pens. A framed photograph of Claire standing beside an older couple with matching smiles. They were probably her parents. She looked younger in the picture, carefree in a way I had never seen inside the office. At the bottom rested a small notebook. I opened it carefully, expecting meeting notes or project timelines. Instead, I found pages filled with quotes, goals, and little reminders written only for herself. Do not let someone else's silence convince you that you are invisible. Another page read, "Kindness is still worth choosing, even when nobody notices." My chest tightened. Had she written those words because of me? Or had she simply been reminding herself not to lose the warmth that came so naturally to her? Then a folded piece of paper slipped onto my desk. It was an old seating chart from our annual charity gala 3 years earlier. My name had been circled in blue ink beside a handwritten note. "She forgets to eat when she is nervous before speeches. Bring almonds." I closed my eyes for a long moment. I remembered that evening perfectly. I had assumed the small bowl of roasted almonds waiting backstage had been arranged by the hotel staff. I had never thanked anyone. How many quiet acts of care had passed through my life without recognition? As the sun disappeared behind the Manhattan skyline, I held the worn piece of paper in my hands as though it were something fragile. For the first time in decades, I admitted a truth that no quarterly report, board meeting, or billion-dollar acquisition could hide. Claire had never asked me for admiration, gratitude, or affection. She had simply cared for me every single day. And somewhere between all those unnoticed moments, I had begun depending on her heart far more than I had ever depended on her work. The answer arrived from the most unexpected place. Early Friday morning, I attended a charity breakfast hosted by one of our longtime partners, more out of obligation than enthusiasm. After the speeches ended, guests gathered around small tables balancing coffee cups and polite conversation. I was preparing to leave when an elderly woman approached me with a warm smile. "Ms. Hayes," she said, extending her hand. "I do not expect you to remember me. I am Margaret Collins from the Children's Literacy Foundation." I recognized the organization immediately, though not the face. "It is good to see you again," I replied. Margaret laughed softly. "Actually, you met me only once. Claire was usually the one who coordinated everything for your foundation donations." Hearing Claire's name outside the office immediately captured my attention. "She always stayed after the meetings," Margaret continued. "Not because she had to. She wanted to meet the volunteers. She even helped us organize the reading room renovation last spring." I stared at her in surprise. "Claire never mentioned that." "She probably did not think it was important," Margaret answered. "That was simply the kind of woman she is." Before leaving, Margaret paused for a moment. "I ran into her again last weekend, actually. She was volunteering at a community learning center in Brooklyn. She looked lighter somehow. Happier. Brooklyn. One word was enough to set my heartbeat slightly off rhythm. I thanked Margaret, returned to my car, and quietly repeated the address she had mentioned until I could no longer forget it. The learning center occupied a renovated brick building on a peaceful residential street lined with maple trees. Children laughed somewhere inside while colorful paper decorations hung across the front windows. It felt like a completely different world from the polished marble and steel surrounding my headquarters in Midtown. I remained inside the car for several minutes, watching people come and go. Parents greeted one another by name. Volunteers carried books and art supplies through the front entrance. Then I saw her. Claire stepped onto the sidewalk carrying a cardboard box filled with children's picture books. She wore blue jeans, white sneakers, and a cream-colored sweater instead of tailored business suits. Her hair moved gently in the afternoon breeze, and she laughed at something a little girl had just whispered to her. I froze. During 6 years together, I had rarely seen Claire truly laugh. At the office she had always been composed, professional, careful not to occupy more space than necessary. Standing there now, she looked wonderfully free, as though an invisible weight had finally disappeared from her shoulders. A young volunteer held the door open for her, and Claire smiled with such effortless warmth that my chest tightened in a way I could not explain. I realized then that I had never been the source of that smile. Perhaps I had spent years giving her reasons to hide it instead. My hand reached instinctively toward the car door handle before stopping halfway. What right did I have to interrupt the peaceful life she had finally found? I had dismissed her resignation with 4 cold words and expected the world to continue exactly as before. Yet there she was, building a new chapter without me, surrounded by people who appreciated the kindness I had accepted without acknowledgement for far too long. As I watched Claire disappear back inside the learning center, I understood something that frightened me more than any failed negotiation ever had. If I waited much longer, I might lose the chance to tell her what I had only recently learned to admit to myself. I did not simply regret letting her leave. I was afraid of living the rest of my life without ever letting her know how deeply she had changed mine. I returned to the learning center the following Saturday with no appointment, no assistance, and no carefully rehearsed strategy. For the first time in my professional life, I was walking into a conversation I could not control. The front door opened before I reached it, and Claire stepped outside carrying a paper bag filled with art supplies. She stopped the moment our eyes met. Surprise crossed her face first, followed by the same calm expression I had seen so many times across my office. "Victoria," she said quietly. "I was not expecting to see you here." I nodded, suddenly aware that I had spent decades negotiating billion-dollar contracts yet could not find a single sentence that felt adequate. "May we talk?" She looked back toward the building, spoke briefly to another volunteer, then turned to me again. "There is a small park across the street." We walked there in silence. The winter air carried the scent of pine from nearby trees, and children laughed somewhere beyond the playground. It felt strangely comforting. We sat on opposite ends of a wooden bench for several moments before I finally spoke. "The office is not the same without you." Claire smiled gently. "I imagined it would adjust." "It has adjusted," I admitted. "I have not." She looked at me with quiet curiosity but did not interrupt. That simple patience encouraged me to continue. "I spent years believing I was rewarding you with trust because I gave you responsibility. What I never understood was that you were giving me something far more valuable every single day." Claire lowered her eyes toward her hands. "Victoria." I shook my head. "Please let me finish. I never thanked you for remembering the smallest details. I never asked whether you were tired or happy. I accepted your kindness as though it belonged to my job description instead of your heart." A light breeze lifted a strand of her dark hair across her cheek before she tucked it behind her ear. "You do not have to apologize," she said softly. "I chose to care." "I know," I answered. "That is exactly why I should have appreciated it." The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. Claire drew a slow breath before speaking again. "Do you know why I left?" I looked at her and quietly admitted, "Because I failed you." She gave a faint smile. "Partly. But mostly because I realized I was waiting for something you were never going to give." My chest tightened. What were you waiting for? Her eyes met mine with remarkable courage. For you to see me. Those 4 words carried more weight than any criticism I had ever received. I did see you, I whispered. Claire gently shook her head. You saw an assistant. You trusted my work. You respected my judgment. But you never saw the woman standing beside you. I closed my eyes for a brief moment because she was right. Every painful word was true. When I opened them again, I found the courage that had been missing all my life. I see you now, I said. Far too late, perhaps, but completely. Tears shimmered in Claire's eyes without falling. Do you? She asked. I nodded. I see the woman who quietly carried burdens that were never hers. The woman who made every room warmer simply by walking into it. The woman whose absence taught me that success feels empty when there is nobody left to share it with. Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. I loved you for a very long time, Victoria. Eventually I realized loving someone should not require disappearing inside their life. I reached across the bench slowly, leaving enough space for her to move away if she wished. Instead, she let our hands rest gently together. Then allow me to begin again, I said. Not as your employer. Not as someone asking you to return. Simply as a woman who finally understands that the most important thing she ever built was never a company. It was the chance to know you, and I almost let that become the greatest mistake of my life. 1 year later, the first thing people noticed about Hayes Global Holdings was no longer its record profits or ambitious acquisitions. They noticed the atmosphere. The executive floor that had once echoed with hurried footsteps and careful whispers now felt unexpectedly welcoming. Employees still worked hard, deadlines still mattered, and excellence remained the standard, but something subtle had changed. People smiled more often. Birthdays were celebrated. New hires were greeted by name instead of employee numbers. Someone even placed fresh lilies in the lobby every March without being asked. They reminded me of home, just as Claire had once remembered. Reporters occasionally asked what leadership seminar or consulting firm had inspired the cultural transformation. I always gave the same answer. I finally learned that people build companies. Numbers only measure what people create. It was the truest statement I had ever made. Claire never returned as my executive assistant, and I never asked her to. She deserved a life where she could be appreciated for who she was rather than defined by a title. Instead, she continued directing community programs in Brooklyn, helping young students discover confidence through books, art, and patient encouragement. Watching her thrive in a place that reflected her generous spirit became one of the greatest privileges of my life. Our schedules remained demanding, but we made time for what truly mattered. Some evenings we met at the small neighborhood cafe where I had first tasted her favorite cinnamon tea. Other weekends we wandered through Central Park without discussing quarterly earnings or board meetings. We talked about childhood memories, favorite novels, forgotten dreams, and the countless ordinary moments we had overlooked for years. I discovered that Claire laughed whenever squirrels chased each other across the grass. She learned that I secretly loved old jazz records because my father played them every Sunday morning. We were no longer learning how to manage calendars. We were finally learning each other. One crisp autumn afternoon, Claire visited headquarters for the dedication of a new educational foundation our company had established together. The lobby buzzed with employees eager to greet her. One by one they thanked her for the kindness she had shown them over the years. I watched from a short distance, realizing that every story sounded familiar. She had remembered a sick parent, encouraged someone through self-doubt, quietly celebrated another person's success, or simply listened when nobody else had time. Claire had always changed lives without asking for recognition. The difference now was that people finally told her so. As the ceremony ended, we stood near the same floor-to-ceiling windows where I had once believed success was measured only by the skyline beyond the glass. The city looked exactly as it always had, but I did not. Claire slipped her hand gently into mine, and this time I did not hesitate. I smiled without thinking, earning amused glances from employees who once believed such a thing was impossible. One of the younger analysts whispered to another, "I have worked here 3 years and I never knew she could smile like that." Claire heard the comment and quietly laughed. "You know," she said as we looked across Manhattan together, "I used to think the strongest people never changed." I turned toward her, grateful for every unexpected turn that had brought us to that moment. "The strongest people do change," I answered. "They simply find someone worth changing for." Looking back now, I understand that the greatest investment I ever made was not in technology, real estate, or global markets. It was choosing to open a heart I had kept locked for far too long. Every empire eventually finds its limit, but genuine kindness has a remarkable way of multiplying. And sometimes the woman who quietly walks away is the one who finally teaches you how to walk toward the life you were always meant to live.